The night was quiet inside the Whitmore mansion, but Emily Thompson's footsteps echoed faintly in the marble halls. She carried a silver tray, balancing crystal glasses so polished they caught the dim chandelier light and splintered it into 1,000 tiny stars. Yet no one ever noticed the stars. No one ever noticed Emily. To the wealthy guests who dined, laughed, and raised their champagne flutes within these walls, Emily was nothing more than a shadow. A presence in the background, a pair of hands that set the table, scrubbed the floor, pressed the linens. When their eyes passed over her, they didn't linger. They slipped away as if she were invisible. And in many ways, she was. Emily had lived like this for years. She knew every corner of the Whitmore estate, the hush of the library at midnight, the sharp scent of roses from the east garden, the creak of the servants' staircase when the house was sleeping. Yet for all her familiarity with the mansion, it never felt like home. It was a world of marble and silk where she didn't belong, a gilded cage where she was expected to remain silent. She was 24, though some days she felt much older. Her face was soft but marked by exhaustion, her hands calloused from work. In the mirror, she often searched for the little girl she once was, the child who dreamed of becoming a teacher or maybe a writer before life had taken her parents and forced her into servitude. But the little girl had long vanished, replaced by a woman who moved like smoke, unnoticed, unheard. That evening, as the last candle in the dining room flickered low, Emily lingered by the window. The city stretched beyond the mansion gates, alive with lights and movement. People out there lived with purpose, with joy, with voices that mattered. She wondered what it might feel like to exist out in that world, not just to clean after it. Her thoughts were interrupted by voices drifting from the grand hall. She heard laughter, the clinking of glasses, the smooth, commanding tone of Richard Whitmore himself, the man who owned this empire of wealth and silence. To Emily, he was a distant figure, as untouchable as the moon. She had seen him only in glimpses, a tall man in tailored suits, with eyes that seemed to measure everything and reveal nothing. He was power incarnate, the kind of man who could move markets with a word. And Emily was the kind of woman no one would ever remember. Still, she could not deny the strange pull she felt whenever his shadow passed her by. Not attraction exactly, but a sharp awareness, as if he carried storms inside him and she could feel the static from afar. Yet what did it matter? He didn't know her name. He never would. Emily sighed and returned to her duties. She collected the plates, carried them through the servants' corridor, and stacked them neatly in the kitchen. Each action was mechanical, practiced safe. That was her life, safety and invisibility. If no one saw her, no one could hurt her. If she stayed small, the world couldn't break her again. But that night, as she prepared to retreat to her tiny attic room, something stirred in her chest, a flicker of defiance, so faint she nearly ignored it. The thought came unbidden, dangerous, impossible. What if I wasn't invisible? What if just once I was seen? The idea startled her, made her heart race as though she'd spoken it aloud. She shook her head, chastising herself. Dreams were for people with choices. Emily had none. And yet, in the stillness of the mansion, as the wind whispered against the windows, the thought refused to die. Somewhere deep inside, the invisible Maid was waiting for something to shatter the silence, waiting for the moment when shadows would no longer be enough. The following morning dawned cold and gray, but inside the Whitmore mansion, every corner hummed with preparation. Servants rushed to polish the chandeliers, arrange bouquets of lilies and steam gowns in hidden chambers. The Golden Phoenix Gala was approaching, the most coveted event of the year, where the city's elite gathered to parade their wealth and whisper their alliances. To the staff, it meant endless work. To Emily, it meant nothing at all. Such worlds were not meant for her. She bent over the marble floor of the gallery, scrubbing until her knuckles turned red. Her hair had slipped from its braid, a dark strand falling across her cheek. She pushed it back impatiently, lost in the rhythm of her task. That was when a shadow stretched across the floor, long and deliberate. She froze, sensing a presence. Slowly, she lifted her gaze. Richard Whitmore stood before her. Up close, he was even more formidable. Tall, broad-shouldered, his black suit sharp as a blade, he seemed to command the very air around him. His eyes, cold, calculating, almost unreadable, rested on her with unsettling focus. Emily's heart lurched. He had never looked at her like this before. In fact, he had hardly looked at her at all. "Emily, isn't it?" His voice was low, steady, and carried the weight of command. She swallowed hard. Yes, sir." For a moment, silence stretched between them, heavy as stone. Then he said something she could never have imagined. "I want you to accompany me to the Golden Phoenix Gala." The brush slipped from her fingers and clattered against the marble. She blinked, certain she had misheard. "Sir, forgive me, but I'm only a maid?" His eyebrow lifted slightly, though his expression remained unreadable. "Yes, I'm aware." Emily's chest tightened. "Then surely you don't mean—" "I do." His tone allowed no doubt. "You will attend, tonight." The world seemed to tilt beneath her. Attend? The gala? Among gowns worth more than her lifetime wages, among men who controlled empires with a handshake? She couldn't. It was unthinkable. "But why me?" she whispered, almost to herself. Richard studied her as if weighing an answer, but none came. Instead, he turned sharply, already walking away. Over his shoulder he added, "Be ready at 7. And then he was gone, leaving Emily kneeling on the floor, her breath shallow, her mind spinning. The hours that followed blurred into chaos. The housekeeper pressed a gown into her hands, a garment unlike anything Emily had ever touched, midnight blue silk that shimmered like water under starlight. She hesitated, trembling as she slipped it over her shoulders. The fabric hugged her frame, transforming her reflection in the mirror. For the first time, she did not look like the invisible maid. She looked extraordinary. Her hair was swept into an elegant twist, her lips painted a shade she didn't recognize as her own. When she turned, the woman staring back at her was a stranger. And yet, strangely, she felt alive. By the time the clock neared 7, Emily descended the staircase with uncertain steps. At the base waited Richard, immaculate in his tuxedo, his gaze sweeping over her with something unreadable in its depth. For a flicker of a second, she thought she saw approval. "Shall we?" he said simply, offering his arm. Her hand trembled as she placed it upon his. The chandeliers above glittered like 1,000 eyes, watching. Somewhere in the distance, engines roared to life, ready to carry them into a world Emily had never dreamed of entering. And as the doors opened, she felt the first crack in the walls of her invisible life. Tonight, she would step into the lion's den. Tonight, the shadows would no longer protect her. The limousine rolled to a stop in front of the Grand Aurora Hotel, its golden facade glowing like a palace of fire against the night sky. Paparazzi lights flashed in a storm, their cameras clicking in rapid fire as the city's most powerful men and women stepped out in jewels and gowns that shimmered like constellations. For Emily, seated beside Richard Whitmore in the back seat, every sound felt deafening, every flash blinding. Her palms were slick with sweat against her silk clutch. She could hardly breathe. "I shouldn't be here," she whispered under her breath, but the words were swallowed by the roar of voices outside. Richard turned to her, his gaze steady. "Hold your head high." The car door opened, and a hand beckoned. Richard stepped out first, tall and commanding, cameras exploding like fireworks as they captured him. Then came Emily. The instant her heel touched the carpet, the world seemed to halt. Whispers rippled across the crowd like wind through dry leaves. Heads turned, eyes widened. Who is she? Not his usual company. Wait, wasn't she? The murmurs grew sharper, more venomous, as Emily walked forward, her arm hooked through Richard's. The midnight blue gown clung perfectly to her form, its silk trailing behind her like liquid shadow. The diamond earrings glinted at her ears, borrowed treasures that made her look every bit the lady. But the eyes that followed her saw something else. She was a servant in his house, someone hissed. Unbelievable. Whitmore must have lost his mind. Dragging a maid into this? The venom pricked Emily's skin like needles. Her instinct was to shrink, to let the shadows swallow her whole. But Richard's presence beside her, steady, unyielding, kept her spine straight. She forced her gaze forward. though her heart hammered so hard she thought it might split her chest. Inside the ballroom, the grandeur was overwhelming. Crystal chandeliers cascaded from the vaulted ceiling, scattering light across marble floors polished to a mirror's sheen. The air was thick with perfume, laughter, and the clinking of crystal glasses. Gold and crimson banners fluttered from the walls, marking this as the Golden Phoenix Gala, a symbol of rebirth, of power rising from ashes. Emily felt anything but reborn. She felt like prey tossed into a den of lions. Couples waltzed across the floor in gowns that sparkled like starlight, while servants in pristine uniforms carried trays of champagne. Emily realized with a pang of irony that she should have been one of those servants. She should have been invisible, carrying drinks to those who now dissected her with their stares. Instead, she stood among them, their curiosity burning hotter than the chandeliers. "Whitmore's gone eccentric," one man muttered behind his glass. "Or perhaps he's trying to prove something," another replied. Their laughter was low and cruel, but Emily heard every word. She fought to keep her expression neutral, but inside her chest tightened until it was hard to draw breath. She wasn't ready for this. She wasn't prepared for their judgment, their ridicule. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to flee back to her attic room where the world couldn't reach her. And yet, she stayed. Something deep inside her refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Richard guided her across the ballroom with effortless grace, his hand firm on hers, his expression carved from stone. He ignored the whispers, the stares, the sneers, and somehow that strength bled into Emily. Each step became steadier, each breath easier. Still, she could feel the question tightening like a noose around the room. Why her? As the orchestra swelled, the music grand and commanding, Emily realized the night was only beginning. She was no longer invisible, but being seen came at a price. And soon, that price would demand payment. The gala reached its peak with the orchestra's final crescendo. Laughter echoed, glasses clinked, and the chandeliers above seemed to burn brighter with the fever of celebration. Emily stood near Richard, every nerve frayed from enduring the whispers that sliced at her from every corner of the ballroom. She tried to disappear into the silk of her gown, but tonight, invisibility was no longer possible. Then, Richard's voice cut through the noise, calm, commanding, unyielding. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, lifting his glass. Instantly, the room hushed. All eyes turned toward him, toward them. "Tonight, I wish to introduce someone remarkable, someone whose presence here is no accident." He turned slightly, his gaze landing on Emily. "I give you Emily Thompson." The sound of her name spoken aloud in this glittering hall was like thunder. A wave of shock rippled through the crowd. Emily's breath hitched, her body froze. He couldn't mean for her to... But he did. Richard's hand gestured toward the small stage at the center of the room, his expression unreadable, yet resolute. Her legs felt like stone. Her pulse thundered in her ears. For a heartbeat, she thought she would faint. Yet somehow, step by step, she found herself walking through the sea of eyes and whispers. The ballroom grew silent, a silence heavier than noise, pressing against her chest as she climbed onto the stage. Dozens of faces stared up at her, faces sculpted by wealth, by privilege, by disdain. She saw narrowed eyes, smirks behind jeweled fans, and barely concealed amusement. The maid in a gown, a curiosity, a joke. Her mouth went dry, her hands trembled at her sides. For a terrible moment, Emily thought she would crumble, that her voice would wither before it ever left her lips. But then, deep inside, she heard the echo of her own thought from nights ago. What if I wasn't invisible? What if just once I was seen? She drew in a breath, steadied her shoulders, and began. "I was born with nothing." The words were soft, almost fragile, but the silence of the room carried them to every corner. Eyes blinked. A ripple of curiosity replaced some of the scorn. Emily's voice grew stronger. "I lost my parents when I was a child. I grew up not in palaces like this, but in shadows, working, surviving, unnoticed. My hands have scrubbed floors you've walked across. My silence has kept your world polished and pristine. And in that silence, I began to believe what everyone told me, that I was nothing, invisible, unworthy. Her throat tightened, but she pressed on, her gaze lifting to meet theirs, one by one. But I was wrong. The words rang louder, firmer. Worth is not measured in wealth or in gowns or in names that open doors. Worth is found in resilience, in the strength to endure when the world tries to erase you, in daring to step out of the shadows and say, I am here, I matter. Gasps echoed. A few faces shifted, their mockery fading into something more solemn. Emily's heart pounded, but the fear no longer strangled her. She felt free. For years I believed silence protected me, but silence is a prison. Tonight I choose to break it. I choose to stand where I was never meant to stand and speak the truth that every woman in the shadows deserves to speak. We are not invisible. We are not nothing. We are the fire the world tried to smother, and we are still burning. The last word trembled in the air, a spark igniting the silence. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then, slowly, a smattering of applause broke out. One, then another, until the sound swelled into a storm. Emily's chest rose and fell, her hands still trembling. But she had done it. For the first time in her life, she had been seen. And nothing would ever be the same. The echo of applause filled the Golden Phoenix ballroom like rolling thunder. At first hesitant, then swelling, growing into something Emily never thought she would hear, approval. For a moment she stood frozen on the stage, her breath ragged, her heart hammering, unsure if what she heard was real. It was. A woman in a gown of crimson silk rose to her feet, clapping with eyes glistening as though Emily's words had touched some hidden wound within her. A man near the orchestra, silver-haired and austere, nodded solemnly as he brought his hands together in measured applause. Soon, more followed. What began as scattered acknowledgement became a wave that swept across the hall. Emily's throat tightened. She had expected ridicule, perhaps even cruelty. But this was something else entirely. Still, not all were moved. She caught the sharp sneers of those who clung to their scorn, their whispers bitter. It's a performance, a stunt, Whitmore's game. Yet their venom no longer pierced her as before. For the first time, the jeers did not define her. When she descended from the stage, her knees unsteady, Richard Whitmore was there. He offered no applause, no visible approval, yet his gaze locked on hers, steady and unreadable, and for a flicker of a moment she saw something different, respect. Guests began to approach. One woman, draped in pearls, leaned close and whispered, "You spoke what I have never dared. Thank you." Another, younger, her voice trembling, said, "I felt invisible too. You gave me hope." Their words tumbled over her like warm rain, strange and overwhelming, but real. The orchestra struck up a softer melody, filling the air with music once more, but the atmosphere had changed. Conversations no longer ignored her, eyes no longer dismissed her. Emily had crossed an invisible threshold, and though not everyone welcomed her, she could no longer be unseen. As she stood near the edge of the dance floor, she felt a strange stillness inside herself. For years she had shrunk into silence to survive, yet now, having spoken, she realized the silence had been her prison all along. And tonight, she had broken free. Richard's voice came at her side, low and deliberate. "You understand what you've done." Emily turned to him, her hands still trembling. I only spoke the truth." He studied her, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if searching for something hidden within her words. Then he inclined his head. "And the truth has power." Before she could respond, another guest approached, requesting an introduction. Then another, and another. Soon, Emily found herself surrounded, not by disdain, but by curiosity, admiration, even reverence. They asked about her story, her past, her courage. She answered in fragments, still stunned by how swiftly the tide had turned. But beneath it all, one thought burned bright. This was not about gowns, nor chandeliers, nor the glittering eyes of the rich. This was about voice, and hers had finally been heard. The night wore on, and the ballroom slowly began to empty. Yet the whispers that lingered now were different, no longer cruel speculation, but wonder, questions, inspiration. Emily could feel it. Her words had struck something deeper than the gilded surface of the gala, something human, something raw. When she returned to the limousine, exhaustion settled over her shoulders like a heavy cloak. Yet beneath the fatigue was a fire that refused to dim. As the car pulled away, Emily gazed out at the city lights blazing against the darkness. She had stepped into the lion's den and walked out not as prey, but as something else, not invisible, not forgotten, a flame. And the world had begun to notice. Weeks passed after the Golden Phoenix Gala, but its echoes did not fade. Newspapers ran bold headlines the next morning. The Maid Who Dared to Speak. From Shadows to Spotlight, Emily Thompson's defiant words. Social circles buzzed with her name, some with admiration, others with scorn, but all with fascination. The woman who was once invisible had become unforgettable. For Emily, life inside the Whitmore mansion had changed in ways she could hardly grasp. No longer did the other servants look past her. They now met her eyes with something new, pride, even awe. Strangers sent letters, some praising her courage, others begging for guidance, for hope. Among them were voices of women who had endured silence, who felt seen through Emily's words. At first, it overwhelmed her. She was no leader, no politician, no symbol. She had been a maid, a survivor. And yet, each letter spoke the same truth. Her voice had given others permission to find theirs. Richard noticed it too. One evening, he found her in the library, stacks of unopened envelopes before her. She looked up, her brow furrowed in doubt. "I don't know what they expect of me. I spoke once. That doesn't make me someone worth following." Richard regarded her with that piercing gaze that always seemed to see too much. "You spoke once," he said slowly, "and the world listened. That is rare. Do not waste it." His words stayed with her long after he left. That night, as the city pulsed with life outside her window, Emily realized something. Her speech had been the beginning, not the end. If she retreated into silence again, then her moment at the gala would become nothing more than a curiosity. But if she carried it forward, it could become a fire. The first gathering was small, just a handful of women, seated in a modest rented hall, their faces etched with the lines of struggle. Some were maids like she once was, others shop clerks, widows, seamstresses. Emily stood before them, nervous, her hands cold. She had no chandeliers above her now, no glittering gowns in the crowd, only real people waiting. She drew a breath, her voice trembling but determined. "You may think you are invisible. I once believed the same. But invisibility is a lie the world tells us to keep us silent. And I am here to tell you, you matter. Your voices matter. Together, we can step out of the shadows." Tears glistened in the women's eyes. One by one, they began to speak, sharing stories of pain, resilience, and survival. The air filled with raw honesty, with courage unbound. That night, Voice from the Shadows was born, not just a movement, but a promise. Months later, the gatherings grew larger. The names spread across the city, whispered in kitchens, echoed in factories, scribbled in letters. Women who had been silent for years began to stand tall, to speak, to demand to be seen. And at the heart of it all was Emily. Not as a maid, not as a curiosity, but as a leader. Standing before a hall packed with hundreds, Emily lifted her chin. Her gown was simple now, her presence steady, her voice strong. "I was once a shadow," she told them, "but tonight, I look at you and I see 1,000 flames. Together, we are not hidden. We are unstoppable." The roar of voices that answered her was not applause. It was a chorus, a rising storm of unity. Emily felt tears sting her eyes as she gazed out over them. She had once longed for nothing more than to be seen. Now, she was not only seen, she was a beacon. From maid to flame, from silence to movement, Emily Thompson had stepped out of the shadows. And in doing so, she lit the way for countless others to follow.